Yes, love's a secret weapon. Yeah!
Hi, I'm Donna Loren.
And I'm Dr. Adam Gerace.
And you are listening to Love's a Secret Weapon podcast.
Music, 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 and a little TV show called Shindig. Welcome back to part 3 of Donna's reading of chapter 7, Wishin and Hopin. Shindig personifies music. Music of every genre that gave birth to rock and roll. That is, if you take a little blues, add a lot of soul, then a solid dose of youthful inspiration and a big dash of rebellion, and voila, rock and roll and shindig. Then wrap it all up with an English twist that producer Jack Good used to stir it up, and America woke up to the greatest cultural experience. So get ready to rock out as Donna takes you on stage and backstage at Shindig.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a humble man named Jack Good. I'm also the producer of Shindig. I thought it might amuse you to know that the Beatles are coming!
The British invaded the same stage with the artists from the USA. Jack Good featured everyone from the Supremes to Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye to Tina Turner, Beach Boys to Stevie Winwood's first band, the Spencer Davis Group. The stage was set with risers for dancers to do their go-go choreography designed by Andre Tailleur and his assistant Tony Basil, who would go on to create her video sensation. Prototype for setting trends in dance clubs all over the world. Those boots weren't only made for walking. Those infamous go-go boots, usually white, were made for the mashed potato and the pony too. A new breed of music makers were on the scene with long hair and tight pants. Paul McCartney and John Lennon sang "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which sounded sexier than Great Balls of Fire. Mick Jagger was singing "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" with such a sneer on his lips. A nasty side of his life was blasting the already controversial rock and roll genre. A highlight of mine was being on the show with the Rolling Stones and Marianne Faithfull. Jack Good drove his white Rolls Royce on the stage for Mick Jagger to sing "Spider to a Fly." I thought Annette was endowed until I saw Marianne Faithfull. She walked on stage wearing an Empire Liberty print dress, smashing her very healthy bustline. And how innocent she looked in her schoolgirl leggings and long bangs fluttering into her eyelashes. If I only knew at the time that she and Mick were an item. I felt a real sense of rebellion in the air, an authentic feeling of I'm not taking it anymore. The fact is that it was a multifaceted effect coming from Detroit's Motown sound, LA's Mamas and Papas and Beach Boys, the Brill Building in New York, Muscle Shoals, plus now the Isle across the sea. Change was coming from great minds of music in a sort of vortex that sprang from a well of life force that they all had in common. And Jack Good was assembling this group of pioneers on his stage where I could witness and be part of the beginning of a movement that is still in progress today. Shindig was special in another way. Music was pre-recorded, but performances were all live. To my knowledge, without exception, every band, including the Beatles, would go into the studio, re-record their own track to sing live to. The four Fab agreed to do it for Jack Good because he insisted upon authenticity. The end result was having a unique experience with each artist for an audience of television viewers that were conditioned to watch artists lip sync, or at best, do a watered-down version for primetime TV. For performers like myself, Bobby Sherman, and the Righteous Brothers, who didn't have their own band, the house band would pre-record the track and then we would perform live. Mega hits such as "You've Lost That Love and Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers were introduced to America on Shindig.
Baby, I love
Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield were known to me as the blue-eyed soul singers who sang songs like Little Love of Mine and Little Latin Loopy Loo. Now, after being seen as regulars on Shindig and coming up with these monstrous songs, they became institutions. It all started on the lot of Prospect and Talmadge. Rehearsing and filming for Shindig kept me very busy, and I was still filming for movies like Pajama Party or new Dr. Pepper commercials. In between, I was continuously doing local TV promotion. Acts like the Righteous Brothers and Sonny and Cher were doing these too. We were all promoting our records in L.A. on shows like Hollywood A Go-Go with Sam Riddle and The Lloyd Thaxton Show, an American Bandstand when Dick Clark moved from Philly to L.A. He even had a show called Where the Action Is. One of the several times that I appeared on Sam Riddle's show, I met Neil Diamond for the first time. He was shy and demure when he met me. Wearing a green army jacket, he was promoting Solitary Man. I loved that record and was excited that he was there, even though he acted more excited to see me. Back on Shindig, Jack Good the Innovator cast Marvin Gaye and Tina Turner in a special edition of the show called Shindig Plays. The format of the show I would loosely put in the genre of rock and roll opera, the precursor to the first rock opera Tommy. The Wellingtons open by singing The Game of Love, which sets the tone for the theme of the show. Tina Turner starts by singing to Marvin Gaye, I Need Money. He comes back to her with I'll Be Doggone, with her edgy reply of That'll Be the Day.
Wait a minute, let me tell you a little something about the money, honey. All right. Well, I'd be doggone if I wouldn't work all day, baby. And I'd be doggone if I wouldn't bring you my pay, all of it, baby. But if I ever caught you running around, throwing my money all over this town, then I wouldn't be doggone. Hey, 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 I'd be long gone, long gone. I wouldn't be doggone, baby. I'd be long gone, I'd be long gone. Now, hey, hey, hey. Now, did you hear me? I want to tell you about this. Well, now, what'd I say? What'd I say? Money that a lot of money. I want some money that that's what I want.
The scene follows is a duet by Bobby Hatfield and moi. We sing I Must Be Seeing Things, continuing the storyline followed by Leslie Gore and Bill Medley singing You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'. Woven in between scenes in Benny Hill-esque slapstick, Jack Good was so ahead of the time. Not only was he a humanitarian embracing the roots of rock and roll that the United States would not accept from the waist down, remember Elvis on Ed Sullivan? Jack also dealt with the racial issues of the day and heroically took a stand to unify great artists. I was mooned by one of the Kinks as I passed by their dressing room. Never saw his face to know which one. One of my pastimes is cutting hair, and when Howard Kalin of the Turtles sat still long enough, he was at the mercy of my shears. Fortunately, the dress rehearsal of the Turtles was impeccable, and when Dean Whitmore, the director, reviewed how short Howard's hair was in the real show, the dress rehearsal was edited in for the broadcast. That's the only time, to my knowledge, an exception like this was ever made. Sometimes I would get my hair washed in the makeup room and sit next to Cher while she was getting her hair washed too. For her, they'd have to move her chair out about 3 feet to accommodate the length of her hair. My agent, John Hartman from the William Morris Agency, would hang out in my private dressing room sometimes. My dad gave us some freedom to be alone, based on our professional relationship. What was going on behind closed doors was not professional. We made out before it was time for makeup and hair. He actually asked me to marry him and would get me flushed by touching my back in a certain way. My friend Janice was backstage with me when her school schedule permitted. She'd roam the hallways and run back to my dressing room while I was preparing for the show to tell me her starstruck stories of who she just saw and, oh my God, blah, blah, blah. You know, girl stuff. Here I am, gluing my second layer of false eyelashes, and she's giggling over Bobby Sherman. Good stuff. Jack Good was the first person who let me have some independence. He gave me my own dressing room, let me create my own look, makeup, and hair, and helped me choose songs. He never dictated. Some of the sets that he had the crew design for me were over the top. When I sang That's What Love Is Made Of, I was perched high in an overstuffed armchair filled with stuffed animals. He found ways to complement my youth and give me a comfort zone. Sunshine and Lollipops is another good example. The soundstage looked like a blown-up version of Candy Lane, and I just got to be the singing lollipop.
Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, everything that's wonderful is what I hear when we're together. Bright and lucky, and when you're here, the gray clouds disappear here, and I feel so fine. Just to know that you are mine. My life is sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. That's how the sweet rain goes. So come on and join in. Everybody, sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. Everything that's wonderful is sure to come your way. 'Cause you're in love, and love is here to stay.
On a more serious note, Grecian pillars surrounded me while I sang The Way of Love in a full-length gown that I made. I recall singing Heebie-Jeebies, which was really challenging as well as rewarding. I was reminded of this song when I went to see my son Joey play with his friend Smokey Hormel at McCabe's in West L.A. Smokey performed that song to perfection, paying tribute to the 1926 recording Louis Armstrong made. Some people in the industry acknowledge this as the first improvised vocal recorded. An auspicious occasion arose the day Ray Charles starred. Billy Preston, the great organist who played with the Beatles, and Bill Medley were rehearsing a song. Ray Charles sat in the audience with his two bodyguards. Bill and Billy came to the edge of the stage and called to Ray. "Come up here," they said. "We have something to show you." Of course, any comment that included a visual put a smile on R.C.'s face. What I was about to see is forever embedded in my memory. From the middle of the audience, Ray's two bodyguards took him by the arm while his body lay limp as they virtually dragged him down the aisle. I could see his toes grazing the floor. Of course, his bodyguards lifted him high enough so that his body didn't literally drag. I'm just giving you a visual of a man who, at the time, had to be carried onto the stage. As soon as he arrived at the piano, both Bills were surrounding Mr. Charles. He took his place at the piano bench and sat erect. I had been around little Stevie Wonder on the set of Muscle Beach Party, so being around a blind person was a comfortable experience. Little Stevie needed help navigating his way through an area, but maintained a graceful posture while being guided. The vision of Ray Charles limp in the arms of his bodyguards is very disturbing. When at last he took command over his body, I was relieved. What ensued was even better. An organ was rolled over next to the piano. Billy Preston began playing a familiar tune, while Bill Medley chimed in singing Georgia. In his own inimitable way, Ray Charles swayed back and forth as the two Bills serenaded him. The smile, the joy emanating from the trio was enough to lift me to the proverbial cloud 9. I'm still floating.
Georgia, oh Georgia, and the whole day through. Yes, it's just this whole sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. I said, Georgia, no, oh, Georgia. And the song of you comes as sweet and clear as moonlight through the pines.
Let's talk a little bit about your preparation for your audition for Jack Good and ABC. How did you approach it, Donna?
You know, thanks for asking, Adam, darling. It was kind of an unusual morning for me. It just felt, I had a very heartfelt relationship with Jack Good and the people at Shindig. It was not calculated, there was nothing intellectual. And I think my intuition just kicked in and said, hey, wait a minute. Your status quo of preparing to look very professional and going in not just as a teenager, even though obviously I was, but as I approached it that way, I thought of a skirt that I had made, and it was actually a school project, not a personal project, to make this plaid skirt that matching up the plaids in the seams was a big challenge for me. And because it was a circular skirt, it wasn't like a pencil skirt, it's like straight seams. So I was very proud of, that I was able to do that. And I literally didn't wear it I don't think I wore it much to school, but I kind of saved it. And then, that felt like school to me. I was just going to present myself as a student rather than, a career woman. And so I was going to a private school that I rarely attended because I was usually on the road for Dr. Pepper. But I was going to school that day and getting ready for the audition. Maury, my dad, had to drive me into Hollywood where it was, where the school was, and then pick me up for the audition. And when he dropped me off at school, apparently he didn't really object to the way that I looked, and he didn't ask questions. But when he picked me up to go to the audition is when he kind of realized that I wasn't fitting the image that he normally expected. Yeah,
isn't that interesting? He didn't notice it when you went there, but as soon as he knew it was work time, it's like, this ain't great.
Yeah. And part of it, I guess, is, his sense of wanting to succeed and keep the momentum, and, any sense of failure would be devastating. He didn't, because obviously this was new in my career, being part of Shindig. It was just maybe maybe a year into my Dr. Pepper contract. Yeah. So he rarely reacted to me, because I usually conformed, but this day he reacted and he showed anger and something in me decided, I don't know, it's kind of like having a hearing aid, just tune him out. I just didn't want to get upset. I didn't want to exert any energy. I don't know. Again, and I'm so glad that I made that choice and just drove from this school on Highland and Franklin, which is pretty much across the street from the Hollywood Bowl, to Prospect and Talmadge, which is pretty far in the east part of Hollywood. And so, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes of driving in silence with him kind of, simmering,
Yes. You know what's going on. Absolutely.
And also, as I've maybe explained with you, that the parenting role of my, that my mother and father chose to do was literally reversed, when I became the provider of the family, and I really had to take on their emotion, and maybe they reverted back to some inadequacies or, insecurities that they felt in their lifetime. And so I just had to cope with that as well. And when I arrived at ABC Studios and met Jack Good, who did I meet first? Bobby Sherman, and Bobby confiding in me. I mean, he literally whispered in my ear, "How old are you? And how old do you think I am?" And I mean, I never met this person. I was just sitting next to him waiting to audition. And then he tells me, "Well, I'm really 21, but I'm telling them I'm 18."
Yeah. You were probably one of the few people who didn't have to lie about your age on anything, because you were, if anything, you probably would have added a couple of years.
I did whatever my parents told me to get the job. So unfortunately, that's one thing that really left a scar, because who the heck wants to be lied to and then be told to lie, and then it's just not a healthy way to live. But then meeting Jack Good, it's just almost like the energy was so high-spirited, and there was so much love in the room that it just went along swimmingly. And when he included, he asked me what I like to sing and who I like to listen to. That wasn't really, my usual experience with a producer or a director asking me my opinion. Usually, you have a script, or you have, something that's scripted, even if it's music, and you kind of stick to that, and then you follow the producer and the director. So being included and having that democratic approach of asking me my opinion and what I like was so liberating. And of course, that's why I revere Jack Good to the height that I do, because he was so unusual in that way.
And it almost sounds like, I think he was trying to find the best fit for everyone who was going to be on the show, find the best fit, the best, not persona per se, but just what would fit the best in terms of music and in terms of the types of image. And I guess it also came from, as we've spoken about and as you spoke about in the reading, that, he was a fan of music. He was an aficionado of music as well. So he was so steeped in so many of these sounds, whether it be what was coming out of America, what was coming out of his native England. And, I think, him and his co-producer, David Mallet, who we are actually going to have a conversation with, or you're going to have a conversation with in our next episode. I think they both just loved music so much. They were so steeped in it. And so, seeing what would be the best fit for you and for other people was the way he approached it. Because you see there's some old sort of clips of Jack Good, and he's this very sort of jolly man, sort of promoting Shindig or being on a part of the show. Was that kind of his, how he was? That was his persona?
Totally. He was totally genuine. But may I add also what I think, he was on the West Coast when the Beach Boys were just breaking. We had the California sound with a little bit later, the Mamas and the Papas and the Turtles and the Beach Boys. Then you had the East Coast sound, which came in sooner. And then you had the Philly sound, that was quite early, and the doo-wop sounds, and those were more East Coast. So Jack Good coming to the West Coast and tapping into, me, Bobby Sherman, Glen Campbell, the Righteous Brothers, Darlene Love, James Burton, Leon Russell. He tapped into all of us as we were just coming into our own. And he literally provided us with a venue, to introduce us as we rose to the next level, especially when Glen Campbell came up with By the Time I Get to Phoenix. That was his first big hit. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', the Righteous Brothers, monumental hit, and all of these artists had really not reached the notoriety, beforehand. And even though Shindig wasn't on the air for, so long, and maybe it wasn't given the notoriety it deserved. He still introduced these, all of us to a nationwide audience that normally you would have to be on Ed Sullivan, and if you're on Ed Sullivan, you already have to achieve that status before you're put on the air, so I don't know how to describe it any further than that, but he had an intuitive insight, as to the California sound, and he gave us all an opportunity to blossom,
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? That you talk about what he gave you also was some independence, or at least an ability to be part of the conversation and the dialogue. And I guess also what sort of strikes me is that when you talk about who's on the set, people like Glen Campbell and James Burton and all of those sorts of people, that there probably was a version of it being a bit familiar to you because you'd worked with a range of these people, over the previous few years before they all sort of, congregated on the Shindig set.
Absolutely. Well, I met James when I was 8 years old, because we used to be on a radio show together that was broadcast, and that was also in, the southern part of California. And with Glen, he was a studio musician that I recorded with and, worked at the same publishing company with. And so, and Sonny and Cher, for instance, were promoting their music, and the Righteous Brothers were promoting their music alongside me, in these local California shows, from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And
absolutely. I think you did the Dick Stewart show with the Righteous Brothers when we spoke about in a previous episode about that. But also, and I know if we just look at some of, even the roster, some of the people in the band, people like Al DeLore or Steve Douglas were your producers at Capitol Records.
I know. It was a tight-knit group, even though it didn't feel preferential. It wasn't like Jack Good was singling out anybody. It wasn't an exclusivity. It's just that we were all located on the West Coast in California, in Southern California, where all of this action was happening.
Yeah, for sure. And when you talk about the nature of the set and how it just felt right to dress a certain way for the audition, to approach it in a certain way. I know we've spoken a lot about this in other episodes and just in our own conversations about when, going in the flow or doing something intuitively that seems right. And I kind of wonder, did that play out? Because ironically or interestingly, you basically had just gotten back from the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars tour, and you had gotten sick on the sort of last sort of day of that, and so your 22 days were sort of cut short, and you missed it by one, and eventually sort of Maury sort of caved and said, okay, I guess we need to go home. But you very quickly then had to get onto the Shindig set to essentially sort of get going on rehearsals there. So it almost seems like perhaps that set was quite a happy place and sort of gave you something that some of the other jobs might have not.
Yeah, that's pretty perplexing, isn't it? How energy works. When you feel supported, your whole demeanor changes and your whole energy changes. You can even feel sick, but suddenly, I don't know, life takes on a new meaning and your energy just has a spike in it. And that's what happened because to break it down, I'll just say that on the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars tour, I was booked on that tour to represent Dr. Pepper.
Yeah.
But there was never a meeting. And I do have a regret about this, which I really don't want to put too much energy into. But, I really had to work hard on my own without any guidance to just, meet my obligations and do my performances every night on the tour. But I was literally the only unknown on the tour. Every single act on the tour, even the Supremes, who were just getting known, had a
Yeah.
lot of music play, and eventually by the end of the tour, they had a #1 hit, Where Did Our Love Go?
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I was not presented in a way where it was as beneficial as it could have been to represent Dr. Pepper. I mean, that's why I was there. And the whole tour was sponsored by Dr. Pepper.
Yeah.
And every
Yeah.
venue we went to, you know, the only beverage that was served besides water
Yeah.
was Dr. Pepper. It wasn't Coke or Pepsi.
No.
And so, you know, there was no strategy. And therefore, you know, I just did my standard songs that I thought I could, you know, kind of do with new musicians, not too much rehearsal. And Dick Clark also would introduce me in such a way where he would build up this kind of expectation that it was Annette.
Yeah.
And so, you know, then I would appear, he'd say my name, and there would be this, you know, in the audience. And sometimes there were, you know, 10,000 people, maybe more in an audience.
Yeah.
And so I kind of had to overcome that and work really hard to build the enthusiasm by them not really knowing why I was there.
And while you might have won them, and I'm sure you did win them over, you know, by the end of the set, that's a lot to have to put on a performer's shoulders to, you know, he built that expectation that Annette's going to come out and then it's not. And then have to get on and perform and do the best that you can there, all the while, I guess, sort of always feeling like there wasn't a plan. There wasn't some structure for building your career so much as it was like, here's a job to win, here's another job. And kind of that idea that the grand plan was to support the family, but there wasn't really this grand plan and focus of how to develop a career in order to do that.
That's right.
In order to develop something fulfilling.
That's right. And so, and even the company, even Dr. Pepper, you know, they had a PR department. Obviously, that's why I was part of their company. But it was kind of left up to me, and I just didn't have the wherewithal to think about it. But in hindsight, you know, I'm thinking to myself, you know, now that we're doing this podcast and I'm analyzing my past, it would make perfect sense that Dick Clark announced me as the one and only Dr. Pepper girl, and, you know, and that I've just co-starred with Annette and Frankie on the latest Beach Party movies. And then I could go on and sing my jingle, you know, and say, raise a glass, you know, to the Dr. Pepper girl. And everybody in the audience obviously is going to have one, you know, they're all drinking Dr. Pepper, and Dick Clark could, you know, do that as well. And I would have had kind of the identity so that everyone would be, you know, more supportive of who I was. And then they would also be able to expose the songs that I was singing in the Beach Party movies, which, you know, most of them well, not actually, only Muscle Bustle was released as a single, but that was the first song that I sang with Dick Dale.
Yeah, and see, I kind of wonder then if you sort of had to, I guess, temper the audience's expectations and sort of take that on, and you know, whether getting sick at the end of the tour was almost your body's way of you know, trying to get you to stop, or even just where you're just taken on too much, and it was one of those rare occasions, given how busy your schedule was, where you actually kind of, you know, physically broke down.
Yeah, I think you called it right on. You just drive yourself. I guess it's more on that adrenaline survival modality. And I just broke down, collapsed. And I mean, I was only 16 years old. I mean, I should have had more energy than that. But I think just coming up against all those obstacles, you know, is exhausting. It's I guess it's like an athlete, a young athlete being trained incorrectly, and you know, you just keep trying, but eventually you break down a little bit until you readjust. So, I mean, I literally saw in my diary that by the time the plane arrived in Los Angeles with Maury and myself, it was 11 o'clock in the morning. And then at 4 o'clock that same day, I was due for my first rehearsal.
Which is just insane
at
to think about. I mean, just even getting back at the best of times from the tour and then going straight onto the new show. But the fact the night before you'd been sick. And, I know we've spoken about this before, but you spoke about when you were very young and you had your first asthma attack, you almost sort of realized kind of in a weird way, so young, that almost like the only time you felt you'd get kind of the attention from your mother was when you were sick. And I almost wonder, I don't know, I mean, this is something that we can't prove, but whether almost that sort of physical breakdown was a way to be shown from your adopted father that he had some care for your welfare.
I think that's absolutely correct. Everybody needs attention, and everybody needs. If you feel ignored or neglected, you'll either act out positively or somehow negatively. And sure, I did not do that, but unconsciously, I'm sure that I was waiting to see if this man who was my guardian, who was my parent, actually was concerned for my welfare and didn't think of me as just a machine, just keep going. So he did show me a little bit of compassion at that point, and noticed that I had fever. I was, obviously out of condition, it's like, sorry, gone surfing, or gone fishing. And but how resilient, to have to travel under those circumstances. But then I was really looking forward, maybe unconsciously, to being with Jack Good and within his energy.
And it's, I think that kind of set that he created and that kind of atmosphere. And of course, we've spoken about in the reading about why Shindig was and remains revolutionary. The pace, its style, its melding of sound, but it also sounds like the kind of environment that was created was something that was special for the artist as well. Yeah,
and I'm just thinking, I remember hearing Drew Barrymore talk about Steven Spielberg, being the same way for her as a parent, because I think that she had difficulty with both of her parents, and at such a young age, being an E.T. and Steven Spielberg being a compassionate person. I think to this day, he's become the father figure for her and other actresses that probably needed that parenting rather than, having it at home or having it the way we expected to come from.
Yeah, and certainly with the younger members of a cast. I mean, again, you would have been amongst the youngest people to perform on the show, because to go back to, we're talking about how relentless your schedule was during these years, but how did it work once you were on Shindig? What was your day-to-day sort of, how many days a week was Shindig? How many days was, other Dr. Pepper, promotions and recording and so on? What did a general sort of week look like for you?
Well, I recall, 3 days a week. It was 2 days of rehearsal and 1 day of filming for Shindig. And then I literally filled in with between auditions, traveling for Dr. Pepper. And I just didn't really have much time off at all. And the times that if I didn't have a job, on that day or part of that day, then I would be taken to Hollywood, which was quite a distance from where I lived, to attend this little school. And and I remember being at that school not very often, but I met these two girls. I only remember one of them. It was her name was Dury Parks, and Dury was not Parks at that point. But by the time I retired, and when I was 21, one of the artists that my husband was producing was Van Dyke Parks, and he married Dury, and,
right, yeah.
And so coincidentally, when I did go to this little school, Dury actually befriended me and invited me to her home in Hancock Park. It was actually her grandparents' house that had like 3 stories to it. It was a big old house. And I ended up going there, while I was a teenager, but I also, after I was married, ended up going there when she was married to Van Dyke. I mean, she was a brilliant woman, young woman. But it was kind of like a dead-end school. Like for me, I was enrolled because I could graduate and I could travel and I didn't have to attend.
Yeah.
And it was set up to be accredited that way. But it was a very, very small school. And the kids that went there, maybe they didn't fit into the Orthodox, either private or public school situation. And so they ended up there,
Yeah.
It was kind of like that.
I guess it was just to kind of tick off what needed to be done, because that wasn't the priority for you at that time. And so, I guess the 2 to 3 days a week on Shindig was sort of the bulk of what you were sort of doing at this time. And am I right that there was kind of obviously the recording that was done for the main show, but there also would have been a dress rehearsal with an audience?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
There were 2 audiences there, so that each audience was about 300 young, mostly young people. And and we did, the show from top to bottom live straight through, and they were all videoed, and then had this technique of kinescoping, which is filming for their own record, because the video was not that well known then, and they didn't, you could record over that.
Yeah.
Which is what ultimately happened for many of the shows.
So what happened, because I know you've got a bit more information about this, in the previous episode we had an excerpt from Little Steven's Underground Garage where he, devoted some time on an episode to Shindig, because he's a fan of Shindig as well as a fan of your work in particular. He likes the song So Do the Zonk. Which is a cool one to kind of hone into, the dance craze that wasn't,
Yeah, he liked the guitar part. That's what he liked.
Absolutely. And he kind of speaks about that the original tapes were taped over at ABC.
Yeah, the video.
The video was done by most probably The Dating Game. But you're
crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, which you ended up being on, which is just a whole other, sort of weird coincidence there. But you did come across quite a few years later, that some of the tapes may have survived.
I was contacted by a fellow in New York who said that some of the masters of the videos, and so I met him in New York actually, and to view them, and went to test it out. We went to Paul Schaefer because Paul was a big fan of Shindig, and so I tested it out with him, and he verified. He's like, "Oh my God, this is exactly the quality that I remember seeing, in black and white on a small television, and the sound and everything." And then if you go on YouTube, you'll see that what is mostly representing Shindig came from the kinescopes, which if you're aware of, for instance, downloading a tune and then transferring it to an MP3, each time you change it, it loses a generation of sound. And so the original video that I have a few copies of some of the performances that this man made for me, and they are seen on my channel on YouTube, as well as maybe a few clips on my website. So you can see the original quality, and it was just by chance that he discovered these, and also with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame got wind of him. And so whenever they had an award show that they needed a Shindig tape, they would go to him first to see if he had an original. And then speaking with Bobby Sherman, there may be more originals in a vault at Disney Studios, because when Disney bought ABC, they took over whatever product. So there may be a few treasures in their keeping that nobody has ever seen.
Does because I remember you meeting up with Henrietta Morel, who was the widow of
Leon
Morel, who was the Shindig, or was the
production company. It was Selmer Productions. That's right, of course. And did she have some of the tapes, or did she have some of the kinescopes? She had all the kinescopes.
Right, yeah. Along with, I think, Dean Whitmore, the director, had also had a collection of them as well. So who knows what's sort of out there. And I know we're going to talk about this in the next episode, but I think from memory, one of the performances on YouTube, which is from the actual high-quality tapes, is Shaken All Over.
I believe so.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the performances, because it does, in your reading, it kind of sounds like there's a lot of sort of behind-the-scenes stories, which we'll get to in a minute. But I guess of some of those performances, and you talk about quite a few, you were often paired with Bobby Sherman when you were doing duets, the Righteous Brothers, particularly Bobby Hatfield. But, of course, you had predominantly a lot of your performances were the solos. Which ones stick out for you as particularly memorable?
I do recall enjoying the Sunshine and Lollipops production with the choreographed, and the sets, were very colorful. And first of all, trying to do a Leslie Gore song, and that it was written by Marvin Hamlish, that's a big project to take on, just like Wishin and Hopin, Dusty Springfield and Burt Bacharach.
Absolutely. No slouch.
So and that particular dress that I wore was supplied to me. I didn't make it, and that was cool, because whenever I needed to supplement and something fit me, it was just fun. It was a variation, but so that one stands out. Another one that stands out for me was I was given a tandem bike, and Bobby Sherman was to sit behind me, and I was to sing the only song that I ever got to sing on Shindig from the Beach Party movies. And it was called Cycle Set. And Bobby was, I don't know what he was doing behind me, but but that was fun. And plus, that was probably the only time that we were together, but he didn't sing. Right.
So he was just kind of there for prop, or to kind of be on behind the bike, and it was sort of emulate
it was really fun. We also did another duet. I think it was called Searchin'. And I really liked doing that with him. As a matter of fact, he wanted to do that with me recently. He wanted to redo it. And that was when we reunited a few years ago. And that never materialized. But I was happy to know. Yeah, I was a hippie happy to know that he even had it on his mind.
That's fantastic. Was he thinking of recording it in his sort of own?
Yeah, he has a home studio, and he said he made a lot of gold records out of that studio. So
I bet. Yeah, I hope if Bobby is listening, because I know you occasionally are in contact with him and his wife Bridget. Doing Keep On Searching would be a cool way to end 2020, or to begin 2021.
Sure, absolutely. Or any of the duets that we did, that would be fun.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about, Cycle Set, that you had to kind of, be pedaling while singing, because as you say in your reading, the actual performances, that the vocals were live. You performed them live on Shindig. They weren't pre-recorded.
Yes,
vocals.
Well, that's what you have a boom mic for.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean, that's like dancing as well, cycling or dancing. When you have that boom mic, it picks up everything. So it's just up to you not to run out of breath,
Yeah, I bet. And that kind of brings up an interesting point, because as we know, the performance was live. Often, if the music could be pre-recorded, but that was even by bands that came on, they would go into the studio and record their track for Shindig. So even though it was wasn't live in the sense of them doing that music in the moment during that performance. It wasn't as if they were emulating their record.
Exactly.
Basically.
I mean, I think they did that to authenticate it, because Jack requested that. And he just wanted to keep it so fresh and so alive, and so they would, the Stones, the Kinks, anyone would go back in the studio and record their tracks, and then perform live, singing wise, to their own instrumentation, unless they didn't have a band. But everyone that I'm aware of, that occurred.
And that would include the Beatles on the performance that we played a little bit of in the previous episode, which is, the fact that Jack could get these bands to be willing to do this. And in I guess in the case of you and Bobby Sherman and other people that didn't have a band, then they would make use of the house band.
That's right. And what a pleasure.
Yeah. Not a bad one to have.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, they were the best on the West Coast.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that, and we're going to speak in future episodes about, Beach Blanket Bingo album and other, other performances and other recordings. But certainly you did really have access to the best of the best on the West Coast in terms of
the best
musicians.
In the West. Absolutely.
And and I guess where, we spoke about Wishing and Hopin, which, has been a song that you did a version of it, an actual record in the 1980s when you did some recording then. And you also, your other performance of Shaking All Over, which we go into depth with in our next episode and with the interview with David Mallet, who he talks about the selection of that song and so on. But you, of course, recorded that song in 2010 when you released your Love It Away album, that you did a reinterpretation of Shaking All Over. But you also performed it at a concert in the last couple of years.
Oh, that was fun. When I launched my book, Pop 60s, I was at a venue called Tiki Oasis in San Diego, and it was all mid-century, everyone from 10 to probably 90, or maybe even, just who loves the 50s and 60s, the cars, the clothes, the music, the architecture, the whole lifestyle, even the diet, all of the early Americana that belongs to that era. And I was invited to launch my book there and invited to do a concert. So I put a band together and rehearsed. And one of the features of the band was a man named Deke Dickerson, who was a great guitarist and knew how to play surf guitar music like Dick Dale. And so between he and this fellow, Willie Aaron, who basically became my musical director and keyboardist, put the band together with vocal backgrounds and even a violin and a cello.
Fantastic.
It was quite a nice production. And so since I hadn't performed for literally 50 years, the first time out, and the audience was very receptive. They loved the music, and by the time they heard the introduction of Shakin' All Over, they sang the whole song with me. It was great.
Yeah.
I loved that.
Fantastic. That's great. Yeah, I guess that song just has such a history, and people just know it. And the minute that music comes on, they know. So what a nice reception to get, particularly after so long, in terms of performing a full concert, to be able to give that song one more shot at life.
Absolutely. It was a whole lot of fun, I have to say.
And of course, we talk a lot about the performances on camera, and as you've said, a lot of the performances can be seen on your YouTube channel, which is fantastic that we have access to those shows, even if many of them are the Kinescope. At least we've got them for the record for all time. But some of the stories you talk about, backstage, like for example, Ray Charles, and that story that you tell about Ray Charles being taken to the piano.
Astounding.
It's astounding, isn't it? Just the image of that.
Yeah, and just being a young person and seeing someone of that stature, and also physical being. I was around Stevie Wonder, and I saw how a young, blind boy, carried himself and was escorted and performed. But seeing Ray Charles, in this limp position, just kind of being lifted by the elbows and letting his feet drag. I'd never seen anything like that, but I really can't enunciate that he was in any particular state, because I don't know. It just appeared that he was limp until he was taken up on stage and sat down at the piano, and then he sat erect.
And thank goodness that when he did start performing, I mean, that, it would be terrible to sort of have that image of him. But then when he started performing, he was completely on.
I really didn't see, for instance, like a Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, or people that came a little bit later, or maybe toward the end of my career, who, loved performing in an altered state of mind. And, that was not my experience, in the earlier days between 63 and let's say 66, that whole psychedelic age had not really manifested at that point.
No,
but
absolutely.
But the old jazz days, Billie Holiday and, the reputation of jazz musicians, Miles Davis, being involved in really hardcore drugs and performing, under that influence and making masterpieces, which, we all love and adore and praise. But it was definitely in that altered state, and I just wasn't exposed to it. So, it was definitely a unique experience to see.
Yes. I can imagine. Oh, goodness, and just thinking of, I think some of your experiences backstage at Shindig, being so, I guess, watched over by Maury, we're fairly innocuous. But I must say that, like you said, most of the time the performances were what was broadcast was what was done during the recording of the show, but there was that rare occasion where, or perhaps the only occasion, where the dress rehearsal had to be used, and it was all down to you.
Yeah, I was bad girl.
Bad girl with the scissors again.
I love cutting hair, and one of the turtles, had some long strands hanging in his face, and so I said, okay, well, let me borrow a pair of shears, and I'll give you a trim. And I guess it was a kind of a close shave, and so
wasn't the image they were going for. Howard Kaylan
they wanted that long hair, and so literally the filmed version of the dress rehearsal was supplemented rather than the live performance in the actual show.
Before you'd attacked Howard Kaylan with the shears. I love it. That's great.
And may I say that when they were singing Happy Together, that a dear friend of mine who is no longer with us, that we will be talking about in the near future, wrote one of their big hits after Happy Together, Let Me Be. And that was P.F. Sloan.
Yeah, Phil Sloan, absolutely. Who we are going to profile in a future episode, having your history with him, but also your husband Jared's long history and friendship with Phil. So I look forward to that. But yeah, I mean, what songs the Turtles just think of Happy Together, and I mean, probably one of the ultimate sort of pop songs of that time. I mean, just brilliant. By the by, but we have in our next episode, we have a few other stories which we will leave for that episode, but including, and I just want to preempt this for our audience, including an Elvis story.
Okay.
But I don't know what else to say, because I don't want to give up so they're going to have to just listen, and then they can and then we can bring it up in a future episode. But yeah, you of course have an Elvis episode. I want to take you back, just because I think this is a prevalent theme in the chapter reading, is the idea of the racial issues, particularly that Jack Good had to deal with, where certain executives were against having a, I guess, racially diverse cast, which I guess essentially meant black and white performance, that they became concerned that it wouldn't, perhaps play in certain parts of the country, which, of course, wasn't the case at all because it was the top musical, show of that first year. But he had to really deal with those sorts of, I guess, decrees of what could and couldn't be done. And he found some very ingenious ways of dealing with it.
Yes, well, it came very natural to him because of a relationship he had, apparently he had a relationship with Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, and who was a freedom fighter in his own right as a politician, and was very supportive of the civil rights movement. And so when Jack was put to the test of the network saying, we don't want to have a mixed crowd on the set, he said, we'll put it in writing. And they never did. And so that's basically how we got to be on the air. They just decided to, I guess, either not just be submissive or, he took a very strong point of view and it worked.
And of course, there was a documentary made a few years ago when Jack was still alive called A Good Man Is Hard to Find. I think that's what it was called. I think the BBC ran it, and he was actually talking about, he mentioned the idea of, basically put it in writing and of course they didn't. But I think he actually did almost come to blows with one of a certain executive who came and visited the set one day about this whole issue of not being happy with what Jack was doing in terms of this. And I think Jack took a swing at him, and from the way he tells it in the documentary, he hit one of the walls on set, and of course, I guess it was plasterboard, so his fist went through it, and then supposedly one of the set designers or carpenters or whoever it was, basically patched it up, and from the way he tells it, wrote, Jack Good's fist was here. So, he did it with words, but he also did it in other ways, and thank God he did. And I know in your interview with David Mallet, he sort of speaks about the difference between what they had experienced in England in terms of the racial situation and then coming to America and having this very different situation of where they did have to go up against this whole attitude of, you can't do that. You can't have this many black artists. For both of them, it was a real shock.
And when you think about, the premiere show was starring Sam Cooke. And when you listen to his song, Change Is Gonna Come, or Chain Gang, he was telling those stories. Marvin Gaye came a little bit later. They were bold, and they were telling those stories. And it was a time that there was the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King was leading that kind of courageous, ability to finally speak up. And of course, it was very, very difficult, and it still is. And it's a pervasive issue. And when you think about it, what I keep hearing is just like when in America, after World War II, the Japanese were put in internment camps, and then afterward, many years later, they were given reparation. And now the big talk is about giving reparations to former slaves or people that were born in, from slavery history, which is going to be pretty astounding. I mean, if that were to come about, Adam, can you imagine the healing on this planet?
And that's the thing,
I would add one more. I would say, not only about slavery, but reparations toward the Native Americans. So America has a lot of healing to do. We planted the seeds many, many, many years ago. And those seeds lay dormant for too long, and they are back, rising through the ashes, and making their voices heard.
And that's the thing, isn't it? And not to get too, because it's a whole other topic. But of course, in Australia, there's the same situation with the Aboriginal people of the awful, horrendous stuff that was done. And people sometimes argue and go, "Well, I didn't do it. Why should I have to pay?" It's not about that. It's about it's about healing, and it's about not wanting a group of people to still be struggling
Yeah,
from.
I mean, it does stem from, I don't know where it started. I do believe that it started with a distorted ego at some point thousands of years ago, when this idea, the ego felt that one was superior than another, and even the human race was superior to the animals and to our resources on the planet, and we're paying a very high price for it, and hopefully humans will realize that in time, because time's running out, and that basically the whole concept is that we are all one. The trees, the rocks, the Beatles, and I'm not talking about the guys from England,
John Paul, Ringo,
but them included. We really are all a part of creation, and that sense of equality that the Dalai Lama talks about. The sense of equanimity, that the idea of the me kind of generation that the 20th century brought forth. Evolving into a collective consciousness, and I think that just the messages that came out in the 60s with artists like Sam Cooke and Marvin Gaye, really, I mean, those songs hold up. And of course, Bob Dylan, who never was on Shindig, but these are the voices that are still prominent, whether they're alive or not. The messages are loud and clear. And it's just taken a lot. Who knows? Timing is very weird. And maybe, as we've said, I think it was Brian Hyland who said the stars were aligned for him. Well, hopefully the stars are aligned for this planet and for all life on this planet to, think more as we are all one, and that we're here to take care of each other, and one isn't better than another.
And that's, when we talk about, of course, on Shindig, Jack Good had a lot of battles to fight, and eventually he left because he just thought, no, that's it, what he was trying to do. And, there was obviously the racial issue. There was also just the issues of, I think, that executive did not get how ahead of its time it was, and how, like little Steven said, how essentially what was being done on MTV in the 80s had kind of been done on Shindig in the 60s. And so he kind of, Jack Good kept working for a little while, but eventually completely sort of turned and ended up living in New Mexico, and he kind of took up painting, I guess, religious icons, iconography, in a little chapel in New Mexico.
That's right. I think he did that for about 10 years until he moved back to England and lived with his son on a farm.
And you had a chance, because you speak a lot in interviews, you speak a lot on this show, just about what Shindig meant to you and how important it was to you, but also how important Jack Good was. And you did have a chance to reconnect with him before he passed away.
Beautiful.
A few years back.
He was so precious. I was hoping to promote my book, and he, because he did a little dedication for my book, and I was hoping to eventually go to England and see him, but unfortunately he passed away, and so that never happened. But it was so wonderful to connect with him, and for me to ask the question, why did you choose me to be part of the cast? And his answer was that he felt he had a spiritual connection with me.
Isn't that fantastic? And like you've said before, that what you've learned since, you might have not had the words for it back then, but sometimes people just know. And, when people are in tune with each other, it makes beautiful television and beautiful music. I tell you,
this is a little off the subject, but the other day when you say, that, the great, I guess, psychiatrist and Carl Jung, philosopher, when asked the question, do you believe in God? He said, believe? I know.
And wow, we've run the full gamut today, from A to Z, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope our audience has, because I think, and of course we've got, after this part, there's one more part where we wrap up sort of the main discussion of Shindig and our interview with David Mallet, which is a really cool I think, gift to listen to, because he's, of course, after Shindig has become so accomplished in the music video industry area. But there's a lot of love for Shindig out there. A lot of people remember it fondly, and for a show that only went for, what was it, 18 months,
Exactly.
I think it ultimately was, or it burnt very brightly, it burnt quickly, but it's very fondly remembered for what it meant to the audience, as well as what it meant to the people on it.
Yes, it documented a time and a series of people that didn't live very long. I mean, many people were lost in a very short time. I think, for instance, Sam Cooke, I think he performed on Shindig in September of 1964, and by December he was shot and killed. Yeah, it was that same year. It was a couple months afterwards, and so, thank goodness we have those tapes of this, and thank you for sharing your memories with our audience and with me as usual. And until it was
next
a
time.
Privilege speaking with you, Adam, always, and to help me understand more about my life and the time that I was involved, and also for the listeners to inject their own analysis and their own impressions of how life is now, how life was then, whether they lived in that time or they've done research about it. It has a huge effect and an imprint on all our lives today.
Yes, love.